the way at least I understand religion is it's almost like the embodied practices in order to contain spirituality, which is so vast and beyond words or, beyond kind of, what's explainable.
Welcome to the Set and Setting podcast with Madison Margolin. As a journalist, Madison has spent years exploring the intersection of psychedelics, cannabis, and culture. This podcast brings together thought leaders from today's psychedelic renaissance to talk about the role of psychedelics in our inner and outer lives. You can support this podcast and find additional resources at BeHereNowNetwork.com/Madison.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Set and Setting. Our guest today is Zeus Tipado. He's a neuropsychopharmacology PhD candidate at Maastricht University, focusing on researching the brain while under DMT inside virtual/extended reality. He's using FNIRS, or functional near-infrared spectroscopy, to give humanity its first glimpse on brain energy distribution in the visual cortex during this unique psychedelic process. Unlike the current trend of psychedelic research that investigates how psychedelics can be used to help depression, anxiety, etc., Zeus is looking at the fundamental nature of a psychedelic trip. He's seeking to understand exactly why and how we trip, and then harness this knowledge to modulate and recreate a psychedelic experience using technology and pharmacological inventions. I'm so happy to have you on the podcast and really excited to talk to you. You're one of my favorite people ever to interview. So thanks for being here.
I'm super happy to talk to you, Madison. And once again, I can't wait to read your book, which I'm very looking forward towards.
Almost out. Yeah. So Zeus actually did me a huge favor and did some fact checking on my book to make sure I was describing some of the psychedelic terms accurately. So I appreciate that. And, maybe we'll get into some of the stuff that was in my book here in this interview, since a lot of it's about religion, mysticism, psychedelics. So let's just start with, how did you get to where you are, right? I know that you have like a kind of religious background that inspired you and psychedelic, first time psychedelic experiences. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So it's a pretty extensive story. I'll try to sum it up as quickly as possible. So when I was a kid, I grew up in a very voodoo background, a voodoo household. I lived in Louisiana, grew up in Louisiana. So I was inundated with Creole voodoo, which is a very specific type of voodoo that calls for incantations and people being inhabited by different spirits and different entities. And I just thought that was the nature of reality. I thought reality, there's the reality that we have right here, and there's this otherworldly reality that influences our reality. And when I was a kid, I saw everything. I saw people, like I said, being inhabited by spirits, then all of a sudden contorting and becoming other people. I saw a lot of totems, a little bit of like sacrificing stuff. So I have experienced a very weird, weird as in, really different from other people background. And I'm not calling voodoo weird. I'm just saying that it's a different thought process. So that was how I grew up. And then all of a sudden, my dad got a job in Texas, and I went from a very traditional Creole voodoo background to learning about this guy named Jesus Christ, and this guy's on the cross, and all this. Everyone's sad because we sinned, and we have to pay for everything. Like a huge guilt trip when I was 8 years old. I'm like, what's happening here? So, of course, I got acclimated into the idea of Christianity. I was exposed to it, going to these huge churches in Texas. I mean, you have to admit, it's a huge sort of geographically induced Christian phenomena of Texas. That's what Texas is. And it was confusing. It was confusing, Madison. It was confusing to see these two different sides of the religious spectrum. And when I got old enough to go to college, I'm like, okay, I just need to have some fundamental understanding of reality. I need some objectivity. So I went to science, straight up science. I began as a biology major, then I went to psychology because I love the brain. And everything was going fantastic. I had great classes. I'm like learning about all these great theories. I'm learning about how the brain, and then all of a sudden, on a Friday evening, my friend gave me some shrooms, 5 grams of shrooms, dried shrooms. Of course, at this point, I mean, I barely even had a beer. I didn't smoke in high school. I didn't have, any beer or alcohol in high school. I was a very sort of straight-laced type of dude. And then I went to the University of Arizona, which is a huge party school. And my friend gave me 5 grams of shrooms. He said, "Hey, try this out. It's fun." I said, "Okay, I'm in college. Let me try out these 5 grams of shrooms." And I ate these shrooms and I had a life transforming experience, Madison. I was tripping hard. Just imagine your first psychedelic experience as a heroic dose of shrooms when you don't even understand what shrooms are. So yes, I was tripping hard. I distinctly remember being outside in front of my apartment, sitting down because it was one of the few things that I could actually do. And my friend Sarah, she gave me a fantastic sort of shoulder massage, which, always feels great when you're tripping. But I looked up in the sky and I saw this huge figure taking over the entire sky, this sort of ever transformative figure that would transform into this sort of ribbon-like depiction of a person that I would go to, an object and a person. And I should have been afraid, but I was just curious. Like, I was so curious to like understand why this thing was floating in the sky. And that was a lot to take in. And from that point on, I, of course, came down. I went to sleep somehow, probably passed out on my sofa, woke up, tried to interpret what I saw. And then I think it was Tuesday. We had a day off. It was like a holiday. And then Tuesday hit. I went to the registrar's office and I'm like, hold up, I got to add a second bachelor's to what I'm doing. I got to add religion. And I added a second bachelor's. I added religion because it was the only way that I could understand this process, this very complex subjective process that I experienced while on 5 grams of shrooms. So that was the beginning of my psychedelic experience, or my sort of research into psychedelics was this very intense shroom experience. And then me just adding a second bachelor's to that whole thing.
Wow. So there's a lot that you said I want to kind of unpack and ask you about. But, for instance, or one thing is you said you had this incredible shroom trip, right? You took a heroic dose your first time. You probably had no idea what you're getting into. And then you're trying to make sense of it. And you're like, I'm going to major in religion. And how do you, I wonder, because we often talk about religion and spirituality and mysticism. So first of all, how do you define these different set, like religion versus spirituality, which feels a lot more agnostic, and religion being like, however, I'd like to hear how you define it. And then why did it feel like the mushroom trip kind of led you to that religious study? Like what was it about that? What was it about the mushroom trip that felt specifically religious, or that you needed to understand it in those terms?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So with psychology, with, majoring in psychology, you're really understanding how the brain operates. You're understanding what, neurons are, what, the perceptual experiences are, what makes those rods and cones, like all of the base understanding of like your own brain. And that's fantastic. And that's great. But then when you add psychedelics into it, you have this thing where your entire visual perception is altered, modulated in ways that you do not understand, ways that actually science is still trying to understand. And at that point in my life, the closest experience that I had to a psychedelic experience was the experience of religion, of voodoo, of trio voodoo, of seeing people in church chanting in tongues, or seeing a person being inhabited by a spirit and altering and contorting and being able to see this otherworldly area, or to experience seemingly other sensory perceptual information. That was the only explanation that I had at the time of piecing together this very complex experience. So as far as this, like, how do you define religion? I mean, that's like a question that probably for lots of theologians have been asked for, hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years. But, and what's the difference between religion and spirituality? Is there a difference? And I think religion tends to be a confined structure, mostly based on religious texts that sort of tells people what to do and what not to do in a sort of confined social behavior. Like, for example, you can't, there's things like, not kosher. There's things like, there's ways to sort of exist in a confined social structure. Now, spirituality seems to be a little bit different in the sense that you can apply a lot of other things to this existence, yet still have the understanding that there is some otherworldly part or otherworldly existence in our reality or in some other reality, but it seems to be less defined, less structured. And I think it seems like spirituality sort of like came out of religion. And I'm assuming that it sort of branched out of religion because people were tired of adhering to very strict religious practices. And I understand religion is a very tough thing to do, whether it doesn't matter which faith you are, Christianity, Hinduism, there's a lot of things you have to do and things that you can't do. And especially in America, we just love our freedom. So we love the freedom to believe in how we want to believe. So it feels like spirituality almost is a cult of religion that sort of goes off and does its own thing, but it's perfectly fine. It's whatever you want to believe in, however you want to believe, you should totally have that freedom.
It's so funny because I would almost say the inverse of what you're saying, where religion is the cult of spirituality, in that, like, and we can go into this and maybe you want to describe it in scientific terms, but like, I feel like humans have an innate ability to have spiritual connection, right? And I feel like, I've having looked into the work of Rick Strassman, for example, who, for those of you in the audience who've never heard of him, he's researched DMT, looking at the prophetic state of mind as described in the Bible and the DMT state of mind, or state of brain, rather, I guess, and finding a lot of parallels between that. And so, the way, at least I understand religion, is it's almost like the embodied practices in order to contain spirituality, which is so vast and beyond words, or, beyond kind of, what's explainable. And the religion brings it down. But again, it's different understandings of it. And so I want to also there's a few things you said. One thing that I just is a little bit of a tangent, but you mentioned in the beginning in voodoo, people being inhabited by spirits. Like, what does that mean scientifically? Like, what is happening?
Yeah, so that's a great question. What is happening? It's there's a lot that's probably happening, and there's a lot. It could be a lot, to be honest with you, Madison. It could be the idea of this thing called expectancy effect, which is basically if you expect to be inhabited by a spirit, you're like, everything will change about, if you have the intention to have this quote unquote spirit inhabit yourself, then you will be inhabited by a spirit. That's one thing about the brain. And people love to discount the power of their brain. And it's sad because your brain is capable of doing some fantastically bizarre things. And a lot of that is just based on the belief of something. And just going scientifically, for example, the idea of placebo, which is actually a very belief thing. It's believing that something will work. So, for example, a placebo is a substance that we give in science to sort of give a base level effect. So a placebo is something that doesn't have any effect. It's like a sugar pill, like, let's say, for example, we're doing an LSD study here at Maastricht where we give people actual LSD. And then we give people a tab that doesn't have LSD, may have some like, citric acid or something, which is the orange juice stuff, basically. So based on placebo research, a placebo should not have an effect. Based on the fact that, it doesn't have any pharmacological agents in it, right? But the thing about placebo is we've seen research where placebo, just the belief in something will give something the properties, at least in the body, of having actual effects. So for example, there was this one fantastic study that happened, I believe in America, where they basically said, look, they had people that had back pain, and they had them in, they had said, look, guys, we're going to give you a placebo. This placebo doesn't have any effect. What's inside this pill has zero effect. It doesn't affect you. There is no pharmacological agent in it that will help your back. But we're going to give this to you once every day for, I think, 2 weeks. And then you tell us how you feel. All these people, they took this pill with the understanding that they're taking placebo. And at the end of the study, a lot of them reported that their back pain went away. So here we even have a person saying that this does not have an effect, yet the ritual of taking something perhaps does something in the brain, and of course it cascades into the body, of alleviating these effects. So even if you don't believe, you could subconsciously believe, or you could actually somehow believe, or your body could believe that something is like helping you out. So I tell people, and of course I'm into science, and of course belief, that's such a weird term, but you cannot discount the power of the brain and belief, for sure.
So
sure.
It kind of reminds me of something that I've said, and, seeing it play out in real time. I'm staying right now, I'm in Israel. I'm in the city called Spot, which is it's sort of the birthplace of Kabbalah, which is like the Jewish tradition of mysticism.
Yeah.
And, I've basically, I see people be like, they're tripping on nothing, like they're tripping on God, right? And I feel like God is the psychedelic, if you believe in God, if you believe in spirit. And again, basically, like, it seems like what you're saying is belief alone can engender some of the same brain mechanisms that an exogenous substance would also do.
Yeah, it's so strange. It's so strange that just the belief in something can actually cause a cascade of processes in which you believe something will happen. Actually, there was a fantastic scientist from Hungary named Balázs Székely. He got his PhD at Imperial College London, and he actually conducted one of the biggest studies on psychedelics ever in human history. Like, I think over 100 people were part of this. And he was looking at whether microdosing had any effect. So he had people, and you could either pick between a microdose of LSD or psilocybin, or of course you get placebo. That's the sort of factor that you throw in there. And he found that microdosing has the same effect as placebo. Meaning, if you think what you're taking is making you better, then it will make you better, regardless of if there's anything inside of it. Just the belief in taking something will make you better. It's something that is still unexplained. It's placebo, and the belief and expectancy effect is one of the wildest things that we do not understand in neuroscience. It's still up for debate.
Do you think the opposite could be true? Like the skepticism effect, where someone takes mushrooms, they're like, this is not going to do anything for me. Like, I might have a good time, but it's not going to fix my anxiety or whatever.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. You always hear stories of, like, let's say your friend's friend or your friend's uncle, they took some heroic dose of psychedelics and they're like, yeah, don't have any effect. And that could just be a person having a strong psychological constitution to deny the subjective experience. That could happen as well. And look, there are people that have very incredible ways of pushing out reality or denying perceptual information that just happens. And that could be some type of biological process. Perhaps they're predisposed to deny certain things. Like there are a lot of disorders that people have, like Charles Bonnet syndrome, in which you or even Anton Blavatsky syndrome, in which you deny your own vision loss. You deny it, and then your brain sort of just says, okay, if you don't have vision, then your brain constructs your own reality. That happens as well. So yes, you could deny a subjective experience, or you could believe it to the point where it happens when there isn't anything. So look, just saying all of this out loud sounds extraordinarily wild, and it's not scientifically explained. We do not have an explanation for it. So it just happens.
So another thing I want to ask, and it's related to what we were just talking about, is I don't know if you've ever seen that meme where it's like the atheist who does DMT and then starts to believe in God or something. And again, I wonder like how much of like the atheism, if they're really hardcore about it, like what, like the full placebo versus skepticism, whatever. Anyways, that leads me into my next question, which is about like, what is psychedelic induced spirituality? Like, is it legitimate? What is happening in the brain? Why are psychedelics occasioning it?
So listen. So that's one thing that's incredible is that psychedelics, I mean, look, it kind of happened to me. I picked a bachelor that was religiously based, but I didn't become religious. I was just curious about religion. But as far as psychedelic induced spirituality, it does happen. It does happen. And when it happens, it's pretty extraordinary. But like, what is psychedelic induced, spirituality? There's a fantastic scientist from Harvard, Michael Ferguson, and his work is on trying to find the correlation between spirituality and the brain to basically see which part of the brain induces spirituality. It was pretty, tough thing to do, but he's doing it. And he found, and I'm going to get a little bit scientific right now, he found that there's an area of the brain called the periaqueductal gray, or the PAG. It's some fluid that surrounds the cerebral aqueduct. And it's basically right in the center of your brain. And this area there's areas of the brain that have high functional connectivity, which means that it's always talking to this area of the brain. Always talking to this area of the brain. And he found that people that have this sort of high functional connectivity with this area of the brain, they don't necessarily have a high sense of like spirituality. They're just, this person, sort of doing their thing. But people that have a low connection to this periaqueductal gray area, they seem to have a very, high aspect of it's the opposite way around. People that have a low connection have a very low connection to spirituality. People that have a higher functional connectivity, that have a higher connection to spirituality. So he found that people that have lesions on these areas that have low functional connectivity have this thing called hyper religion, which they would do things like join, 10 different religions in like a month. And he thinks that by having lesions on these areas that generally have low functional connectivity to the periaqueductal gray, that when you have a lesion on your brain, it it makes things go unrestricted. So this low functional area wasn't inhibiting that information. So now the information is going at a higher rate. And this higher rate is bringing in people to have incredibly intense religious experiences nonstop, like having epiphany after epiphany after epiphany until eventually this lesion goes away, which is incredible. So, okay, how does that even relate to psychedelic-induced religion and spirituality? So how do you measure it? That's the ultimate sort of question. We have these things called inventories, which are basically like big questionnaires. One of them is the Mystical Experience Questionnaire, invented by Charles Pontiac. I can't pronounce his last name, but he created this. Yeah.
Oh, wait, Charles, what Punkeke you said?
I'm completely murdering. It's Pahankke. He's the guy
Pankey.
from the Good Friday Experiment.
Walter Pankey.
Walter Pankey. Oh, why did I say Charles?
All good.
Walter Pankey.
Then
So he invented this thing called the Mystical Experience Questionnaire, which is a way to sort of measure mysticism within a person. And then there's the Hood Mysticism Scale, which was recently invented, which also looks at religion and the sort of, religion and people. But going back to the, so the Hood Mysticism Scale looks at religion in three different aspects: extroverted mysticism, introverted mysticism, and religious interpretation. So those are the three dimensions of this scale. But what is extroverted mysticism? It's basically when like one person finds unity and vastness with the entire physical universe, with everyone, with everything, like we're all one, that those ideas fit into the extroverted mysticism category. But introverted mysticism is like, it like works on the principle that, you are one without, like you are the universe. Like everything else, everything else doesn't exist. You are the only thing that exists. You are everything. You are sort of the embodiment of everything, as opposed to being you are connected with everything. You become everything. So lots of ego going probably. And then religious interpretation is basically how your own religious belief applies to both of those aspects, the introverted and introverted mysticism. And that's how the Hood Mysticism Scale measures mysticism and religion and spirituality. So it's pretty interesting how we define these sort of psychedelic induced spirituality. And then of course, you people take psychedelics and they take these inventories and they have some pretty interesting, results.
So how does that relate to the experience of quote unquote ego death, which, I've found that I don't know if the mysticism scales like acknowledge ego death in explicit terms, but it does feel like this I am everything, like this oneness, whatever, is related to also a sense of your own self being dampened, so to speak. Or if you read accounts of mysticism, in any religion, it's basically talking about how it's not about you, how you're connected to everything else, whatever. So where does that come into play here?
Yeah. So, it's so wild. The entire idea of ego, of self, I mean, that's all from like Freud. Freud said all this stuff, made all this stuff up. And if you look at Freud's work, the guy's kind of BS. There's a lot of BS in his work. He's been called out in modern science, modern psychology. But yet we still have terms like ego. And then, of course, ego dissolution. And, of course, the idea of self. And I think that terms like ego death, ego dissolution should be removed from the psychedelic experience, because the psychedelic experience, Madison, is way more rich than what Freud said, back in the day. We have other ways to sort of interpret this very complex and rich experience aside from things like ego death and ego dissolution. But what those things are, we don't really, we don't understand. We don't have a definition of that. So, but the reason why is because we're so focused on things like ego death. Perhaps ego death isn't just one thing, but it's a combination of a bunch of different things. A lot of different things are at factor, or being a factor in what people call ego death. But your question was, I believe, how does ego death play a role in psychedelic experiences?
And spirituality.
And spirituality, yes. And spirituality, yeah. I mean, you have to ask yourself, like, if you remove the subjective experience, which is the trip, from psychedelics, will people still have things like ego death? If you don't trip, then will you have an experience like ego death? Or will you feel oneness with everything? I mean, religion, there's not really a lot of visual tripping with religion. It's a belief. It's a very strong belief. I mean, depending on there are sort of states that people get into. Most mystics can have this induction of visual, which is amazing, by the way. That's a different topic. But generally, the religious experience does not have this visual component or like a sensory component. But once again, the further you go down the trail of religion, you have people that hear voices, that see things, and those things help them construct their own reality. So, but still the question remains, Madison, if you remove these subjective experiences from sort of extreme religion or psychedelics, what will they be? What will these experiences be? And I argue that really, even if you remove psychedelics from the equation, that really it's about this redefinition of sensory modalities, of vision, of hearing, seeing things that aren't there, hearing things that aren't there. That right there in itself could be enough to have people have these very intense sensations of ego dissolution, of ego death, and all these old Freudian terms that we're trying to get rid of, but I'm saying them right now. But what that is, we don't understand yet. We don't have a full explanation as to what that is, but that's what I'm focusing on. I'm focusing on the idea of sensory perception inside the trips and what that ultimately means.
Well, I guess one question I have related to that is without calling it ego death, whatever is the mechanism of action, whatever is happening in the brain during the experience of ego, of whatever we want to call it.
You can call it ego death. You can call it
ego death. Sure. How, have there been instances of that, that kind of neurochemical play happening without psychedelics? And if so, what are the things that activate it? Is it through meditation? Is it through, collective mass religious experience? Like how can we get there on our own, essentially?
Yeah. No, great question. So actually a fantastic scientist from Zurich, the University of Zurich, Katrin Freeler, this year, she worked on this paper, this fantastic study that came out that actually assessed the differences between a psychedelic experience, meditation, wellness, mindfulness, and seeing the difference in the brain, seeing if people that are hardcore meditators can achieve the same brain state as people that take, LSD or whatever. And she published the results, actually. I saw them last year before the paper was even published, but it's published now. I saw the results, and the results show that, in actuality, the brain state of a psychedelic experience is vastly more complex than a person meditating, or a person just sitting down, or a person focusing on wellness or mindfulness. So based on fMRI, activity, which is brain activity, based on that, which is the blood, the blood activity, based on that data alone, it's safe to say that the psychedelic experience pushes the brain to a much more complex state that cannot be achieved with traditional meditation. I do have to say that perhaps there are people out there that can meditate like the, top of the, meditative food chain, if that makes any sense, that could possibly push their brain to a psychedelic state. However, we do not have evidence that can occur. We only have evidence that the brain states that could be achieved with psychedelics are way different than those that are achieved with meditation and wellness and mindfulness.
What if you're an avid meditator or practitioner of spiritual modalities, and you also have lesion. What were you saying? Like some people have sort of a genetic brain makeup that makes them
Yeah,
more predispositioned to
yeah,
religious spiritual experiences, and you combine that
yeah,
also with modalities, you know,
yeah,
with that
yeah,
experiencing things for some people.
yeah. Listen, if you know, if your brain is quote unquote wired to have hyper religious experiences, then you're also a meditator, then yeah, perhaps your brain could be pushed to a point in which you have this sort of brain state that can be achieved without psychedelics. But also, we have to place this in here as well, Madison. We have to consider that people that are, for example, schizophrenic, that hear things or that see things, have this predisposition to have these very transformative states without the sensory perception that is actually out there. So, yes, those states exist, but we consider them that, oh, those are bad states. We have to get rid of, we have to help them. We have to solve these people that have schizophrenia or mania. But, you know, Madison, let's look back at the past few hundred years of history. I'm going to assume that a lot or a large portion of very distinguished religious figures in the past maybe had elements of like schizophrenia, of mania, in which they heard voices that weren't there. And the reason why they heard these voices perhaps wasn't, God or an entity telling them. Maybe it was within their brain and they had what we call a psychological disorder. But the thing about that is that culturally, back in the day, if you were hearing voices and seeing things, you were the person that people were going to be talking to. You were the oracle. You were the thought leader. You were the shaman. You were the sort of person that had the ability, the very unique ability, to take outer worldly things and bring them into reality. But now culturally, we sort of push that aside. And now we're trying to help these people. We're like giving them, pills and substances to turn down this sensory perception of schizophrenia. But it's really, honestly, Madison, it's just a cultural thing, how we perceive these disorders.
Right. I was going to ask you that next, actually, and you basically answered the question. But, when you think about, the like prophecy, for instance, right, and people talking to God, that could have been exactly that, like some sort of quote unquote disorder. The other question I kind of want to ask you is it, how do I phrase it exactly? Sort of like, when people talk about doing psychedelics and they say if you have a predisposition or a genetic history of, or in your family of schizophrenia or even other disorders, whatever, mania, psychosis, whatever it is, and the psychedelics trigger that, what would actually happen if, say people, not if I, people who have this and also still do psychedelics, but what is it about psychedelics exacerbating it, or psychedelics mimicking that state of mind, right? Like I've heard it said that psychedelics are sort of like an induced kind of artificial psychosis that's temporary, hopefully. What happens when it sticks? Like I've seen also these cases of people coming out of a psychedelic trip and for a while being in some sort of manic state, thinking that they're Jesus or the Messiah or whatever it is. What is that about?
Yeah. So there's actually a thing called hallucinogen persistence disorder. I think there's an extra P there. Hallucinogen persistence perceptual disorder, HPPD.
Yes.
And this disorder is your classic, I guess, acid flashback thing. But it's a little bit deeper than just an acid flashback. So HPPD is a phenomenon in which you take a psychedelic and you trip, and your trip's done, but the trip really isn't done. There's elements of your trip that just reoccur perhaps hours, days, months, years after the initial experience. It's a disorder that's poorly understood by science. There's not a lot of cases that we see, but you hear about it. You hear about people that have this disorder, this problem. And the fact that that disorder even exists is the reason why we it's very ethically difficult to give psychedelics to people that have schizophrenia or bipolar that are bipolar, because the thought is that HPPD is sort of an exacerbation of undiagnosed problems in the brain, or not problems, but like disorders in the brain. And and that's the reason why we can't give people that have like schizophrenia psychedelics, is because yes, psychedelics does mimic the psychosis state. I mean, they were first called psychomimetic, which is a drug that induces, psychosis. That's what psychedelics were first called. That's what we believe they were. And, neurologically and scientifically, yeah, it pushes the brain to a very complex, if not psychotic state. It does. It just does. That's undeniable. It's probably one of the secrets, one of the little dirty secrets that we do not talk about enough in psychedelics. But okay, perhaps that should help us redefine what the psychosis state is, or being psychotic. Perhaps being psychotic. Yeah.
Yeah. Go on. Let's define that as we're talking about it.
Yeah. So perhaps it should help us redefine how we see psychosis, how we see this psychotic state. And, perhaps it isn't just one thing, but it could be a very extravagant prism of other states that we just sort of dump into psychosis. Heck, there's elements that even show that psychosis is attached to creativity. For example, there's a study that we did in Maastricht University in which we looked at the idea of psychedelics and creativity. Like, do psychedelics help with creativity? It's a question that people ask all the time. We actually found that psychedelics does two things. It does a lot. It does a lot for sure, but it does two things when it comes to creativity. It increases this thing called divergent thinking, and it decreases convergent thinking. But what is divergent and convergent thinking? So convergent thinking with the C is, let's say I give you a paperclip, and a paperclip is meant to clip papers. That's why it was designed. Paperclip, clip papers. That's a very convergent way of looking at a paperclip. But a divergent way of looking at a paperclip is like, oh, I can take this and make it into like a little person. I can make it into like a little slingshot. I can make it into a little flower vase. I can make it into flowers. I can do whatever I want. So you have an object, and you find very abstract purposes for a single object. That's divergent thinking. Now, we have data that shows that psychedelics increases divergent thinking and also decreases convergent thinking. So, of course, if you take that and if you apply that to your own reality, your own belief structures, your own, perception on your friends, your family, physical reality, if you have a decrease in a convergent way of looking at your reality or your relationship with your friend or, this table, but there's an increase in the abstract ways in which you look at these things, then yeah, it would look like a very psychotic state. It totally would. Absolutely. But like I said, perhaps we need to redefine what psychosis is.
So, right, that's another question. And I'm forgetting where I heard this from, but someone once said to me that creativity is highly linked to spirituality. And so I want to sort of better understand that. I wish I had the source for it. But is that something that you've seen before, where the creative state of mind is also similar in, similar in appearance, I guess, or whatever, in action to the spiritual state of mind?
Yeah. So, you know what? I was actually in Berlin last weekend, and I was talking about this exact topic. And, I was a little bit controversial. I said that psychedelics doesn't necessarily enhance creativity, but I said that because I wanted people to understand that psychedelics may not enhance the artistic process. It isn't. You can't take LSD. You can't be some endurance runner and then take LSD and then become like Picasso overnight. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't enhance artistic creativity. It could make the process of creativity different, weirder, more interesting. So your question was, does creativity relate to religion, basically, right? Yeah. So like I said, this increase in divergent thinking goes beyond like a paperclip. It goes towards who created the planet, who created the world. You like lean less on objective truth, and then you lean more on possible truths. And that statement, I'm sure a lot of people that have tripped on psychedelics, they've definitely experienced that sort of concept where the objective nature of reality sort of kind of like is not that interesting. And you sort of increase your thought process. So yeah, for sure, psychedelics helps with having a very divergent approach on reality. And of course, religion is a way to interpret reality, like 100%. Absolutely. And it's not about, I think at the heart of religion, it's just, it's a way to interpret life and existence and reality. It's something that, the jury's still out when it comes to the explanation. So with that said, psychedelics helps you have an alternative understanding of the potential of existence. So yes, definitely psychedelics and psychedelic-induced spirituality is a thing. It's definitely a thing. Heck, one of the most intense trips that I've ever seen in my entire life, Madison, was a guy. I used to live in North Carolina, and this guy did salvia divinorum, which is a psychedelic that operates on the kappa opioid receptor. He did it. It's a very DMT-like experience, meaning that it sort of controls your entire visual field. The guy did it. He did not know what to expect. He saw incredible things. He was walking in a field, and he looked up in the sky and he saw what he thought was God, and the end of the world was happening. And he had the worst trip I'd ever seen in my life. The guy broke my coffee table, broke my bong that I just got the same day. Oh, and he broke it. But anyways, he had this very intense, very physical experience. And then when he finally came down, he was in tears and crying. And I asked him what he saw. He told me that he saw God. God opened up the sky, the world was going to end, and he wasn't prepared for the end of the world. From one experience, after that experience, Madison, the guy left North Carolina, moved to Alabama, and became an ultra-Christian Trump supporter.
Wow. Wow.
That's what happened.
Wow, I have so many questions. Okay, where do I start? Well, I have two things that are sort of related. Number one is with regard to spirituality piece. I've heard it said, in sort of religious discourse, that faith begins where knowledge ends. Meaning to say that, it is to have faith in something means that you believe it. It's like a placebo, whatever. You have that belief beyond without evidence that it's true. And maybe that's foundational, or maybe creativity is foundational to that kind of strong belief system, like believing in possibility when you don't, whatever. That's one thing, maybe if you want to comment. The other thing is related to the story about this guy, who did salvia. I've heard terms tossed around that maybe you want to kind of describe, which is spiritual emergence versus spiritual emergency. And they're usually spoken about in regard to psychedelic experiences. Maybe it's happen endogenously as well. But can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So I do have to bring up a fantastic, so on this topic, there's a fantastic evolutionary biologist named Brian Pace, and he co-authored a paper with another fantastic scientist. I'm blanking on her name, but they wrote this fantastic paper called Red Pill, how psychedelics are how psychedelics are pushing, very extremist right wing, sort of pathway. And I bring that up because, we always love to believe that these like sort of spiritual emergencies sort of result out of a person trying to find purpose, or trying to find, trying to be a better person, or trying to be more inclusive, And that's the belief. You go to any psychedelic conference, you've been to some of these conferences, and it's just like it's like a giant, like, hey, we're all wearing amazing hats and we have flowy clothes and we're all one. We're all going to be hanging out in circles. And yes, it's amazing. Okay. That's a very poignant social structure that happens with psychedelics. But it doesn't have to be positive. People also gravitate towards somewhat, not that inclusive groups, in the sense that you take psychedelics and you have this sort of religious or spiritual emergence that turns into an emergency, and the emergency may not be what people expect. I've seen people, and you've seen people perhaps, that have taken psychedelics and they've gone to a very uninclusive sort of group where they sort of see people as outsiders, and they demonize people, and then all of a sudden you have groups forming that are based around hate, based around like rage, based around frustration. But the fact is, there's still two fundamental things happening: is that they're part of a group that has emerged with the psychedelic experience. So the thing about psychedelics is that it has a really strong propensity to let people believe in things like mythology, or things that aren't structured in reality. Let's just say that, you see things, you experience whatever entity, and that's like, a thing for you. But not every person is cut the same, in the sense that psychedelics can only it can only modulate what is inside of us. And if you're a guy that believes that other people are the reason for your misfortunes, and if you take psychedelics, that belief is only going to be increased. It isn't going to go away. I mean, it could go away, but most times psychedelics will only go towards what you believe. And of course, when it comes to a lot of right-wing ideology, anti-Semitism, it focuses on these sort of dumb mythologies that people have in their head, and psychedelics will only exacerbate that. And that's the reason why a lot of like sort of, extremist, racist groups are going towards psychedelics, because it has the ability to inspire this, religious emergence that I believe turns into a religious emergency, because there's a certain sudden thing like, oh my gosh, I just realized that, tall people are the reason why I can't get a job at Apple or whatever, So yes, and that's the thing that people really don't want to talk about, is that, it does have the ability to have abstract thought, but not every single bit of abstract thought is positive. It's not inclusive. There's, people being left out as well.
Well, there's a few, I feel like I'm interpreting this in a few ways. Like,
yeah.
One is that there was a study that I saw years ago that said that that psychedelics could change your political beliefs. Meaning to say that, like, you might start to be more, the open-mindedness effect of psychedelics, whether that's applied to politics or believing in religion, or kind of breaking out of a very sort of like strong and strict religion or whatever. So there's one, the open-mindedness thing. two, I've heard it said that psychedelics just make you more you, right? And so if you are, right wing, whatever, if it's just going to magnify whatever it is. So how do you reconcile these two sort of camps? And related to the openness piece is also, I think, a huge reason why people use psychedelics for healing, being that they are breaking out of patterns, or like all the things that people talk about, the quote unquote benefits of psychedelics, often are when people are, stepping into a different version of themselves and maintaining that in the integration. So, or maybe a more true version of themselves. Again, we're talking about opposite in a way.
Yeah, no, and honestly, Madison, both can coexist. So, for example, Madison, if I give you LSD, right? And you always hear people that take LSD and all of a sudden they think about, like, I don't know, a chapter from like Rumi, or they think about the four worlds and Judaic mysticism, or five worlds actually, Judaic mysticism. Okay, that's cool, but if you don't understand any of those concepts, how any of those concepts come to you? So you can only, every single trip can only go to what you understand. You can't take, LSD and all of a sudden understand, 16th century Baroque paintings or something. You have to have a little bit of an understanding of it. So
context.
So yes, it does. It does sort of increase or go on our existing information, our existing priors is what we call it. Priors is a big thing in neuroscience. But then you talk about, okay, well, there's people that go out, they take 7 grams of shrooms or whatever, and they have these very transformative experiences. And that can also exist as well. And we have a lot of, data, brain data that shows that psychedelics does things like flatten our energy landscape. And thanks to Parker Singleton, he wrote a fantastic paper on this last year, and lots of other scientists have saw that psychedelics does a fantastic job at really just shaking up the brain, and all of these pre-existing connections that we've had sort of kind of go away. Sort of like you're taking a pan and you have, your stuff, and you sort of shake the pan. All of a sudden, all these ingredients have different locations, they're working with other ingredients. And that's what really happens whenever you do an acute dose of psychedelics, just a big dose of psychedelics, you see that things like functional connectivity to areas sort of go away. Things like, segregated areas of the brain, energy distribution sort of, floats away in these areas that we don't, necessarily talk to, or all of a sudden we're talking to, and things are happening. But I tell people this, Madison, like, you take psychedelics, you trip, but it's not only you tripping, it's every single brain cell is tripping. Your entire body is tripping. Every single cell that has a 5-HT receptor and others that don't are still tripping. So it's not just you, it's your entire community of your brain is tripping. And we see these brain cells and these brain areas that have had very established connections are all of a sudden like, oh my gosh, maybe I have been in the visual cortex the entire time. Maybe I should go to the auditory cortex and see what's happening there. And then we get things like synesthesia, which we see things, or we see we see like sound, or we hear color. This is happening because our brain is just really hanging out with people that we don't hang out with, basically, at least in our brains,
So I wonder how that relates to the integration process. And so, I've seen a few things, both with regard, for instance, like having done a lot of research, reporting, whatever, on like Judaism and psychedelics. I've seen two things. Number one is people who come from very religious backgrounds do psychedelics and either loosen up a little bit, it's like, it's okay to not do it in such a strict way. Or they'll say things like, oh, I finally get what, fill in the blank religious leader was talking about, the original mystics or whatever. The other is people who maybe came from more secular backgrounds who did psychedelics and were like, okay, now I'm like on this path. I'm going to be religious. Like, here's how I'm integrating it. I'm into praying now and whatever. And so
Sure.
I wanted to ask kind of about that kind of phenomenon. And also what I noticed is a good integration technique is like, if you're tripping and you do something during the trip, like a yoga position, or you listen to a certain song, or I don't know, I use a hula hoop, which kind of brings me back there. And then you do the same stuff after the trip. Can that kind of evoke similar brain mechanisms of action without the psychedelic, but through the physical embodied reminder of, whatever
Yeah.
souvenir you have from the trip?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic point. And I would say right now we don't have enough evidence to show that that is the case, but I'm going to just hypothesize. So with psychedelics, there's a thing that we found that it has a tremendous persistent effect in the sense that people call it the afterglow. And that's also a thing too. But the persistence of the psychedelic state is a very long thing. Like you take whatever, then you have this afterglow period, maybe like a day. But in your brain, there are things that are still happening that happens days, weeks, months, maybe even years after the first experience. So, okay, now let's say you add some type of physical activity to it, like hula hoop, or jumping up and down, or doing like a lotus position. I would say that yes, it could possibly. Okay, so there's a thing in science called long-term potentiation, LTP, and it's the concept that cells that fire together wire together. This is how we like learn things. This is how we have associations with things. So yeah, heck, you can even look at it in a Pavlovian way. So if you're tripping and you're at your peak, and every time you're at your peak, you do some hula hooping, then there could be an LTP, a long-term potentiation, that is associated with you tripping and then you doing hula hoop. So perhaps when you do your hula hooping again, yeah, I can totally see how the brain will associate those things. I do have to say that we don't have clinical evidence that shows that, but theoretically, I could totally see that happening for sure.
Yeah, I mean,
sure.
It also feels like the body sometimes remembers more than the brain. So you need that physical kind of somatic thing to bring you back to that consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
In my own personal anecdotal experience, I'll say. So, okay, a few other questions before we wrap is, we, I think Albert Hoffman, the person, for the audience who doesn't know, the first person to synthesize LSD, said something to the effect of that LSD is medicine for the soul, which, I could apply that statement to any psychedelic, really. You don't often hear chemists, scientists using the word soul. So what is that in scientific terms?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. That's the question right there. What is the soul in scientific terms? Okay. Well then I'm going to say this, Madison. So we've all heard of like guys like Albert Einstein, of course, Oppenheimer, probably all seen the film. But there's this other guy named James Clerk Maxwell. He was actually a hero of Albert Einstein. And James Clerk Maxwell did some fantastic things. He basically discovered electromagnetism. Without his discovery, this whole conversation wouldn't even happen. And people that are watching it, you wouldn't be able to watch this. In this process, he built these things called 4-vector equations. And what does that, So these 4-vector equations have been some of the most consistent science that we've ever seen. It's how we are able to transmit radio signals, internet signals, everything. But one thing that really isn't talked about because it's so mysterious is he also discovered that everything, every single thing on this planet, your laptop on your table, your feet and your shoes and your socks, the galaxy at Alpha Centauri, a star being born, a water bottle being filled up with water. There's not a single thing in our reality, in our entire universe, that actually touches something. We only interact with electrical fields. So that tells us that this physical reality that we're in, this body, this shirt, this, these glasses, this hat, it's really, truly just a giant electrical field. And when there's an actual field of electricity, we all know the law of thermodynamics and the law of energy conservation. You cannot destroy electricity. And if everything is covered by a field, an electrical field, then something like the soul seems not necessarily so abstract and religious. It seems required.
Yeah, that's a solid answer. I've also always wondered if the study of psychedelics, scientists now having to acknowledge mysticism through the mystical experience questionnaire or whatever, is getting us closer to understanding God or mysticism in scientific terms. Is that something that you've ever tried to do?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. No. The existence of God and science, like science. Oh my gosh. So, Stephen Jay Gould, he was a fantastic scientist. He wrote a book called Rocks of Ages, and fantastic book, by the way. You should read it. Everyone should read it. But he looked at the idea of science and religion, spirituality, and how these things that have really been at odds with each other throughout history, in actuality, they really weren't at odds with each other at all. He believed that science and religion, and also mysticism, spirituality, that they really operate on what he called two different magisteriums, and that they have this thing called non-overlapping magisteriums, which is basically that. And you can here, I'll give you an example, then I'll give it. So imagine what's a non-overlapping magisterium. So let's say you're a chef, okay? And you're in the kitchen and you're cooking. And then let's say you're an athlete and you play basketball. You can't bring a pan to a basketball court and expect to play basketball. And you can't bring a basketball to a kitchen and expect to cook. So using these things, science, in order to explain religion and religion to explain science, you will always be impaired because the tools that you're using are two different playing fields.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so when it comes to God being expressed in science, I mean, that's like saying, that's like saying, why?
Yeah.
What's that? No, sorry, what did you say?
Dribble your basketball with a frying pan.
Yeah, that's basically what it is. It's like dribbling your basketball with the frying pan. And that's how I see the existence of God in science, and of course science within religion. It's something that nothing should be like they aren't at odds. It's just two different magisteriums, two different realms of existence, of thought, of being. It's like I said, it's the basketball court in the kitchen. That's it.
It doesn't mean it's not real, and I feel like that's what Western culture gets wrong. Wrong. I mean, estimation is that like, oh, science can't explain it, so it's not there or it's not real.
There you go. And see, science trying to explain religion. That's basketball in the kitchen.
But it's funny because I feel like religion can sort of explain science. If you get, a lot of Kabbalists, for instance, not a lot, but a few who I know personally even have engineering backgrounds. They actually have strong scientific, and by Kabbalists, I mean people who study Jewish mysticism, which gets very ornate and complex, and it goes into like the different realms of reality and the different levels and the different energy fields and whatever. And it makes sense that that's coming from, that's explored by people who understand that in kind of secular scientific terms. Just saying.
Yeah. No. And to that, I'm gonna say, okay. Did religion build the iPhone, or was it science?
It was science. Well, okay, so this is what I want to get to. I think this is my last question.
Yes.
Is what indigenous cultures have known for decades or for forever, for whatever, ceremonially and is that there is a relationship between healing, health, whatever, and spirituality. And you see that in, for instance, ayahuasca culture or whatever. And meanwhile, in the way that we have it in sort of Western terminology is that like you have religion in one place and you have your medicine in another place. And it's not always so different. And so, and what they found also, I mean, what I guess the correlation that I've heard about is that the extent to which patients who go or study subjects who go in for a psilocybin, psilocybin for end of life anxiety among cancer patients, and the magnitude to which they're experiencing healing also sometimes correlates to the magnitude to which they're checking off criteria for the mystical experience questionnaire. It leads me to wonder, is spirituality or mysticism or religion or whatever inherently good for us or inherently healthy? And what?
Yeah. I'm going to say this. I'm going to say the belief in something is the biggest determination in things like this. It may not be the religion or being religious. It just so happens that this belief aligns with religion. But, let's say if we want to look at belief, there are like, for example, Kobe Bryant, he had such a strong belief in himself that it was almost like, schizophrenic. And like the belief was so strong that he was the greatest or that he could go into a game and play, that just that belief that he was the greatest made him rise to such a high rate of basketball ability and skill. So I think more so, Madison, it's just the belief, the human belief. And occasionally that belief aligns with religion, for sure. So I think it's the belief. I think it's the belief. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, absolutely.
So is there anything else I didn't ask you that you want to add or talk about, or just, like there's so much I could go on and on and on. So
yeah, listen, we go on and on and no, I think that, we covered a lot. Perhaps maybe we'll do part 2 if people want to hear it, but we had a great conversation, great discussion. Once again, I'm in Master University. I'm focusing on the idea of perception, sensory experiences. I'm not really that concerned with how psychedelics make, like fix depression or like help anxiety. That's all fantastic and good. But I'm just focused on the trip. What is that in the brain? Why is that happening? And what can we expect to see when that happens? And yeah, it's going great out here. I'm learning a lot of stuff. I'm working with some of the top people: Natasha Mason, Kim Cooper, John Rainmakers, Pablo Mallaroni, Mara Kavara, Alina Hajian, everybody. Katrin, I'm missing out all the people that I work with. You guys are fantastic. You guys are making me better. You're making me a better scientist. And look, I do want to say this, guys. People call me controversial, and yes, I take that. And the controversy is that I'm looking at reality in a very objective state. But you got to remember that even though I'm looking at reality in a very objective state, my entire focus is the subjective experience of these very intense trips. So I want to say that I'm focused on the trip, but I'm focused on the science of the trip.
Amazing. And how can, I mean, it's like I'm endlessly fascinated and curious about that. And I think psychedelics are one of those things that continue to elude scientists.
Sure.
And so to really, have the, have the bravery, I guess, to go for something that's, could maybe never be officially solved. And I think that's what's so fun about it. So how can people follow your work, just get in touch with you if they need to, or if they're curious about something? I know you've, so many fun studies going on. So how can they keep up?
Yeah. So first off, follow me on all the socials. You can follow me on X, which is what it's called now, at Tipado, Tipado. Same thing on Instagram, at Tipado. Same thing on Threads, at Tipado. I also do Twitch. That's going to be twitch.tv/Zeus Tipado, ZEUSTIPADO. I also have a website called tipado.com, which is there. You can see all my work, and it's all there. Linktree, Tipado, anything. Just Google Zeus Tipado, and you'll find all my stuff. But really, I'm excited about your book, Madison. I really want to read it. I can't wait for it to drop. I've been in your corner. I cannot wait for this thing to drop, and I think it's going to be fantastic. I can't wait to get. I'm hoping that possibly I can get a signed copy. I don't know if it's possible, but I'm hoping I can get a signed copy.
Maybe I should hand deliver you a signed copy and get myself to Amsterdam.
It's all here. Yeah, you're more than welcome. I'll show you. We'll perhaps go to Berlin and have a great time.
Well, celebrate the book. Cool. Well, thank you so much, Zeus. This is always so much fun to interview you, and you're just like an encyclopedia of everything I want to know about. So really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much, Madison. And thank you for having me on your fantastic podcast.
Thank you.